Welcome to The Imperfect Activist, a new podcast on the Be the Change Media Network.
The Imperfect Activist talks all things youth activism, advocacy, and change-making. We address some of the most pressing environmental and social issues while reconciling with the challenges that come with growing up and transitioning into adulthood.
We shed light and face head-on the hot takes of youth activism and climate organising that are uncomfortable to discuss. This podcast will be a brave space where uncomfortable truths are learned and tricky questions are debated.
Because to become stronger, more united and more efficient as a demographic, we need to figure out what real solidarity looks like before we move forward to confront other societal issues with the urgency that is needed.
The Imperfect Activist follows the belief that we don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones. Famous words by youth activist and environmentalist Clover Hogan. Meet your hosts.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Annabelle.
I'm Natasha, and we're excited to talk all things activism and organising with you, chatting with young changemakers from across the globe.
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, we're the future. We've got everything to fight for.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Imperfect Activist. This is the podcast where we get real about what it actually means to be a young person trying to make a difference in a world full of wicked problems. We're all about creating a brave space to ask the tricky questions because, let's be honest, changing the world is messy. And today we are wading into some very messy and murky water. We're going to be talking about money. Specifically, we're asking a question that makes a lot of us deeply uncomfortable. Is it okay to take funding for our climate work from the very fossil fuel companies and big banks that are driving the climate crisis? I've seen it a lot of places lately, and you may have as well. There may be a cool new youth fellowship, an amazing environmental justice grant, a big climate conference, but you look at the sponsors and right there is the logo of a major bank that's a top fossil fuel investor or funder, or an oil and gas company trying to bolster its green credentials. From personal experience, it creates this knot in your stomach almost, right? On one hand, we are desperately trying to fund our work and amplify movements we care about. But on the other, are we accidentally helping the companies we're fighting against? So today we're going to unpack some of that. We'll look at the dire state of funding for our movements, explore the strong arguments for and against taking this money, and try to figure out what real solidarity and ethical action look like in this society. I'm Annabelle, your podcast host for today, and today's episode is a bit different. Instead of having a conversation between different folks, this is more of a reflective piece, and I really invite you to just sit and listen, try to put yourself into the shoes of someone facing the decisions that we're discussing today. Before we can even debate where the money is coming from for our youth-led initiatives, movements, and projects, we have to be honest about how little of it there is in the first place. If you've ever tried to run a climate project, you may know the feeling. It's often a constant scramble. You're writing grants on your lunch break, you're burning out your volunteers, or you're really celebrating a $500 grant like you've won the lottery. And there are a lot of statistics that actually back this up. I did some quick Googling, and a recent report from the Clean Economy Fund found that in Canada, only about 0.9% of all philanthropic funding goes towards climate solutions. That is really low, and the global average is also low at around 1.6%, but Canada is lagging behind. And in the US as well, youth-led efforts got just 1% of climate grants. And when you narrow it down to specifically youth-led climate action, it's even worse. A report from the Commonwealth Secretariat and YouNGO, which is the United Nations Youth Constituency, found that while there's been an increase in funds targeted at young people, it's mostly small-scale grants. And I know this from personal experience as well, who has received numerous very small-scale grants, but struggle to secure more mid to long-term funding, it's often enough money to run a one-day workshop or a small social media campaign or very short program, but it's not enough to build lasting power, I think, and hire staff or scale a project that makes you feel like you're actually creating systemic change. So we are essentially, for a lot of folks, operating in a funding desert. And then over the horizon comes an oasis, which often looks like a big, well-funded fellowship program from a major bank or a community grant from a pipeline community. And the money is there. It looks very accessible, and taking it could mean finally being able to pay your team or launch a project that you've been dreaming of for years. And so this is the dilemma that many youth activists and organizers face at some point. And this is the reality that forces a lot of questions, right? Does it matter where the money for our organizing comes from? What are the implications of being funded by extractive companies and essentially the very sectors and industries that we're organizing against? I think that having thought about this topic a lot and struggled with it myself, this conversation cannot happen without talking about greenwashing, right? We've all seen or heard about it, I'm sure, at some point. It's when a company spends more time and money marketing itself as environmentally friendly or beneficial than it does on actually minimizing its environmental impact. And so funding a youth climate group or initiative it could be a perfect tool for greenwashing, especially for a relatively small investment. Your grant might be a drop in the bucket for them. A company gets to put its logo on your website, or it gets to feature your project in its annual ESG report, right? It can be used as a PR strategy. And these companies get to say, look at us, we support young people, we're a part of the solution for climate action. But while this is all happening, their core business model remains unchanged. There was a 2024 report called Banking on Climate Chaos, and it showed that Canada's big banks are still among the world's top funders of fossil fuels, and their funding actually increased last year. So while one department is handing out, say, a $10,000 check to a youth-led initiative or a climate action group, another department is signing a multi-billion-dollar deal to expand its oil and gas infrastructure investments. And so for some people, this directly impacts our credibility, right? How can we stand on a stage and authentically protest a company that is also a line item in our budget? I think for some people, it really undermines our legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and then more importantly as well in the eyes of the communities that we claim to represent, because it creates a conflict of interest that is there. And then finally, there are also the strings that can come attached. Maybe they aren't written in the contract, but there's also there's almost a pressure, either spoken or unspoken, to not be too critical, to maybe focus your campaign on individual behavior change instead of systemic corporate accountability. And so the money can, I think, in a lot of cases, act as like a muzzle almost, and silence like the most radical and urgent critique that is really, really needed today. So for a lot of people, the line is very bright and clear. I've spoken to a number of organizations and folks who hold this opinion that like taking this money from these funders make us complicit, and it destroys our credibility and compromises everything we're working towards. And so this is a price that's not worth paying, and there's a clear ethical line that they're not willing to cross by taking this money. But activism, as we know, is rarely that clear, and there are other sides of the argument, a more, I guess, pragmatic or logical argument, and that is that these companies and banks have accumulated obscene amounts of wealth by exploiting people and the planet. And so that money, in a way, is already ours because it was generated at our expense. Why shouldn't we strategically take a tiny fraction of it back and use it to fund the resistance, right? There's also the sentiment I've heard from a lot of folks, and I've thought myself too, that if I don't take this money, someone else will. Me rejecting this grant only means that it's going to go towards another youth climate project anyway, so it might as well be me. So I think that some people call this more of a strategic or tactical move when they think about the capacity that this money could build, especially thinking about that funding desert we talked about, a significant grant from a corporate foundation or from a very large funder. It could be the difference between staying as a volunteer-run and burnt-out group and becoming a professional organization that can pay young people a living wage. And it also means that maybe you could hire a marketing expert, a policy analyst, or a full-time community organizer. And it also means that you can stop spending the large majority of your time fundraising and start spending more of your time doing the actual work. And so that's how impact is scaled in a lot of cases, I think. That's how we move from a single workshop to a national program. And the argument here is that the tangible and measurable good you can do with the money outweighs the potential, I guess, reputational harm or other implications of taking the money, especially if you're transparent about it. Some might also argue that it gives you a seat at the table, a chance to influence from the inside. I personally am very skeptical about this, having met with some folks from fossil fuel companies before, or been at youth-led conferences that were sponsored by fossil fuel companies. I think it often ends up with the activist group or the youth group being used as a prop or a token. And there almost is no genuine dialogue actually being facilitated. But I think for some, the idea of having that access or of at least being in that room is a risk worth taking. And so the pragmatic activist can look at the situation and say, the world is on fire right now and we need every tool we can get. And so if we can strategically use our opponent's resources to fight the fire, then we should consider it. And so what do we do now? We have these two, I think, both valid and compelling, but almost contradictory arguments. And this is the messy middle where a lot of activists and youth organizers live. There are no easy answers, but maybe there are better questions and alternative paths, right? I really don't think this is a yes or no discussion. Some groups try to create, I guess, ethical boundaries for themselves, right? They might accept money from a corporation's philanthropic foundation, but they have strict policies ensuring that that donor has zero influence on their campaigns or messaging. And so they are very transparent about where the money comes from and have a clear public statement explaining their rationale. And it's an attempt to get the resources without being silenced. And then there are also alternative fund models that move away from this reliance altogether. Some groups might rely on building a broad base of smaller dollar individual donors through crowdfunding, or maybe developing a membership model where your community directly supports you. Some nonprofits are even started as social enterprises, so they have fee-for-service models where they sell their expertise or a product or an event to generate their own revenue, and this gives them complete independence. And based on personal experience, these paths are often harder and slower, but they also offer, I would say, an assured level of integrity that corporate funding can't sometimes. I think, to throw in an anecdote, relatively recently, I founded and now run a small nonprofit that has a climate education and professional development program for high school and post-secondary students across the province. And so we go into schools and we speak about green jobs. We host events, and we have launched a 3-month youth activator program that is a bit more intensive. We were fortunately funded by my old faculty at university, as well as a government grant called the Canada Service Corps. And both of these were smaller scale grants that combined allowed us to develop our curriculum and then run a pilot cohort. And a year later now, it's time to look for more funding so we can actually scale and run future cohorts of our Youth Activator program and continue going into schools. But it's really been a challenge. Earlier this year, a much larger and established organization that also does sustainability education for youth reached out and asked if we'd like to co-apply to an RBC grant, which caught me off guard. And for context, RBC is one of Canada's big five banks and also consistently the largest funder of fossil fuels through various oil and gas exploration projects and pipelines. And so that was the first time I actively had to reflect on whether I was comfortable and could consider taking this money. I was leaning towards no, but there was definitely a lot of clarity after speaking to everyone from board members to my part-time staff and even the students themselves in the Youth Activator program. It was a pretty unanimous no, and so I got back to that organization and voiced our preference not to move forward on this. And they said that they understood, and to be honest, that this was the first year they even considered taking or applying to this fund, and they've never needed to in the past, but this year they've really been feeling the effects of social funding running dry. And so that was a couple of months ago now, and at the moment I'm still seeking funding. I did think that I would have found something by now, but this is the state that a lot of youth-led projects and initiatives are in. And sometimes I do think back and said, and reflect on, like, what if I did say yes to that money, right? My personal stance on this entire conversation is that this isn't, again, a right or wrong issue or yes or no to taking the money. From my experiences and the experiences I've seen my peers go through, it's really just a matter of personal comfort. I don't feel comfortable taking this funding, and so I won't, because that's a boundary I've drawn, but I also don't judge others who do, because I feel like it's a very complex decision and there are way better things to do than judge other climate activists and community organizers. For example, if someone's access to a funded fellowship is the difference between having a livelihood for a year or remaining unemployed, that decision is going to be different from one that I can make as someone who has the privilege of turning this money down, because whether my project or program runs or not, I have another full-time job. And so for me, this debate comes down to a few things. Transparency for me is always non-negotiable. Whoever you take money from, I think that your community and the people that you're serving has a right to know. Accountability is also very important in terms of who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to your funder or your movement? And if these two things ever come into conflict, you have to know which one you'll choose in the end. And finally, intention as well, right? Why are you taking the money? Is it a last resort in a broken system, or is it a strategic tool to build power, or is it an easy way out for you? And so for us organizers and activists and founders and leaders of various organizations and movements, let's end off with how this translates in the practical sense. First, I would recommend folks to audit their current and potential funders. Before accepting a grant or an internship or fellowship, take time to ask, where is this money coming from? What does the funder stand for? And what do they hope to gain by supporting youth? It's not always about outright rejection, but more about informed consent. Look at who sits on their board. Maybe they invest in extractive industries. And if they're using your work to greenwash or legitimize their brand. If you're part of an organization, you can even create internal red lines like no funding from fossil fuels or arms manufacturers to keep your values front and center. Going back to transparency, I would also just expand on that and say to disclose why you're accepting money and how it's governed. If you do accept money from a controversial source, just be honest about it. I would, make a public statement or include a funding note that explains your decision, the boundaries you've set, and how you'll remain autonomous. And this is how you build trust with the communities that you're serving, and especially with other young people as well. The harm often isn't just in the funding itself, but in the silence or vagueness that surrounds it. But if the money was necessary to survive or continue doing this meaningful work, then you should communicate that. And also, while you're doing that, explain guardrails that are in place. Are there decision-making firewalls? Is the funder hands-off? Are they influencing your messaging? So this clarity really matters. I would also say to continue pushing institutions for public and philanthropic alternatives. We shouldn't be relying on all of these fossil-backed donors or these corporate donors, because the public and philanthropic sectors have failed to fund youth meaningfully. And so I think this needs to change. If you're in a position to advocate, whether at your university or through your city council or via youth roundtables, I would continue demanding that climate funding be included in education budgets, in transition strategies, and in innovation programs. Foundations also need to be held accountable, because only a tiny fraction of climate philanthropy currently goes to youth-led efforts. And so we have to keep pushing funders to shift power, not just dollars. And finally, I would say educate and activate your peers. Youth deserve to know who's behind the money. This is maybe the most important, but also the easiest thing to do, is to just start talking about funding openly with your peers, with your teammates, with your collaborators. A lot of youth feel uncomfortable questioning where money comes from, because money is often an awkward or uncomfortable topic, especially when it's tied to opportunities that we really badly need. But that discomfort is exactly where organizing starts, right? Use social media, teach-ins, even just everyday casual conversations to make funding literacy part of your activism toolkit. And the more we normalize calling out extractive funding and uplifting alternatives, I think the harder it is for bad actors to co-opt our work. And so there is no perfect one-size-fits-all answer, and Indigenous land back movement might have a very different red line or boundary than a group focused on installing solar panels in rural communities. But what matters is that these conversations are happening and that we're honest with ourselves and our communities. And so as we wrap up today's episode, I just want to sit with this notion that our movements are only as strong as the values that guide them. Yes, funding matters. It's really hard to organize without resources, but if the money we accept undermines the very future we're fighting for, then we have to ask, is it worth it? I think that navigating this space won't always or may not ever be clean or easy, but it can be intentional. We have the power to build models that are rooted in justice and to create transparency, to hold our institutions accountable and to support each other in calling things out, even when it's uncomfortable. We don't have all the answers, but we can ask the hard questions together, and we know that from that place we can grow stronger and more honest and more aligned with the future we deserve. So I would just encourage everyone, if you're listening, to keep questioning, keep building, and remember that real change starts when we refuse to compromise on the world that we're imagining for ourselves and future generations. I'm Annabelle, and thank you for tuning in.
We'll be releasing episodes every other Friday, and you can get them wherever you get your podcast through the Be the Change Media Network. You can also find us on Instagram at theimperfectactivist.podcast and on LinkedIn. Be sure to check out all the other amazing podcasts by young people on the Be the Change Media Network. Until next time, bye!
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, well, we're the future. We've got everything to fight for.